Welcome to episode 123 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Gretchen Rubin on how teachers can use the 4 tendencies to help students and themselves meet goals and expectations. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the transcript, links to recommended resources, and to share your thoughts on the show. This episode is brought to you by Screencast-O-Matic. It's an easy-to-use screen recorder and video editor tool that makes flipped and blended learning super simple for teachers. You can record your lessons, give students video assignments, send video announcements, and more. The Screencast-O-Matic video editor allows you to add text and image overlays, even animations, and you can publish to Screencast-O-Matic. So everything you need for video production is all there in one tool. You can get started with 50% off a year subscription at screencastomatic.com/teach. I'm talking today with New York Times bestselling author Gretchen Rubin. I have learned so much from Gretchen's research over the years, starting with her experimentations with happiness from her book, The Happiness Project, and I've also studied her work on habits from the book Better Than Before. Gretchen's latest book is called The 4 Tendencies, the indispensable personality profiles that reveal how to make your life better and other people's lives better too. I invited her on the show because the 4 tendencies are not just another personality type. They're about how people tend to respond to and meet expectations. So, do you work better with inner expectations or outer expectations? Do you need both to be successful? Or maybe you just rebel against any kind of expectation. That's what the 4 tendencies address. When I heard about the tendencies, I immediately saw the application to our work in the classroom because it's sometimes such a challenge to figure out how to get students to meet expectations. And I thought maybe tendencies might be the missing piece here for us. If you have a child who's not turning in work, for example, the way that you would try to reach that student, if the student is a questioner, would be very different from the way that you would support the student who is an obliger. So Gretchen and I are going to talk about understanding students' tendencies as well as our own tendencies so that we can all be more productive and we can accomplish the things that really matter. So Gretchen, let's start off with a super quick review of what the 4 tendencies are for anyone who's not familiar with your research.
So the 4 tendencies are upholder, questioner, obliger, and rebel. And what this tells you, it's about how you respond to expectations. And we all face 2 kinds of expectations: outer expectations like a work deadline or a request from a friend. And then we also face inner expectations, our own desire to keep a New Year's resolution, our own desire to get back into practicing guitar. So upholders readily meet outer and inner expectations. They meet the work deadline, they keep the New Year's resolution without much fuss. They want to know what other people expect from them, but their expectations for themselves are just as important. Then there are questioners. Questioners question all expectations. They'll do something if they think it makes sense. So they make everything an inner expectation. If it meets their standard, they will do it, no problem. If it fails their standard, they will push back. And they typically complain about anything arbitrary or inefficient or unjustified. They always want to know why. Then there are obligers. Obligers readily meet outer expectations, but they struggle to meet inner expectations. And I got my first insight into this tendency when a friend said to me, "I don't understand it. When I was in high school, I was on the track team and I never missed track practice. So why can't I go running now?" Well, now I understand. When she had a team and a coach expecting her to show up, she had no trouble going. But when she was just trying to go on her own, it's a challenge. And then finally, rebels. Rebels resist all expectations, outer and inner alike. They want to do what they want to do in their own way, in their own time. They can do anything they want to do. They can do anything they choose to do. But if you ask or tell them to do something, they are very likely to resist. So those are the 4.
I'm guessing, my audience is teachers. I'm going to make a guess that I think most teachers are obligers. What do you think?
Well, the fact is, obliger is the biggest tendency for both men and women across the board. The biggest tendency is obliger, so it would make sense just because that's a very big tendency in the world. And I should say, by the way, most people can tell what they are just from that brief description. I have a quiz on, if you go to my website, GretchenRubin.com, there's a free quiz that you can take. Like 1.3 million people have taken it. But a lot of people just know what they are from the description. So, but obliger is the biggest and rebel is the smallest.
I've heard you make the interesting point in the past that obligers and people pleasers are not the same thing. That sometimes
Yeah.
people are not obligers because they're motivated to make sure that everyone likes them, but because they are rule followers, they're motivated by not getting themselves in trouble.
Well, and that's a very, very important point because sometimes people think of obligers, they sort of build up a whole mental picture of what an obliger would look like. But the key thing to understand about obligers readily meet outer expectations, but they struggle to meet inner expectations. And they may say, oh, I'm trying to put other people first, or I'm trying to please others at the expense of my own priorities, or I can't take, like, why can't I do self-care or whatever? That might be an explanation for being an obliger, but that is not the essence of being an obliger. As you say, you could be a very curmudgeonly obliger. You might not care about pleasing people at all. You just don't want to get in trouble. Like a very famous obliger is Andre Agassi. I don't think he's people's picture of what an obliger might look like. He's absolutely textbook obliger. If you read his memoir Open, it's obvious that he's an obliger. He like checks every single box. Um, and and sometimes people often they don't see how people can express the same idea in different ways. So for instance, if somebody said to me, "Well, of course I have no time to exercise. I'm a doctor. I give 110% of my patients. I spend all my time at the hospital." Or, "I'm such a badass, businessman. I spend all my time like closing deals. I don't have time to eat right." That's obliger talk because it's everything is meeting these outer expectations and then there's not and I'm not meeting these inner expectations. That's still an obliger. It's not what everybody thinks an obliger looks like, but that's definitely the way an obliger might describe themselves.
For me, I'm a questioner. So
Mm,
I don't do anything that is the way it's always been done. In fact, if it's
yeah,
always been done that way, then the first thing I want to know is why.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's what makes it really easy for me to do the work that I do in creating productivity resources for teachers and the 40-hour teacher workweek club because I've always questioned everything about the way we do school, everything about the way we do life, and I'm always looking for these more streamlined and more meaningful, more impactful ways to do things. But one of the things that I've noticed about teachers who are in the club is that my fellow questioners tend to get results right away. So they show up and they're like, yeah, let's figure out what's not working and why, and let's start doing things in a way that makes more sense. But sometimes it's a little more challenging for obligers and upholders to jump in there because they have this different way of approaching the external expectations that are placed on them by their principals and by their school districts. So when I think about tendencies in relation to habits, I'm wondering what do people with each of the different tendencies need to keep in mind when it comes to wanting to streamline? And you were mentioning just now self-care habits and that sort of thing. How does your tendency play into the way that you're going to establish those habits?
Well, the most important thing I would say, and partly one of the reasons most important is because obliger is just the biggest tendency. So you either are an obliger or you have many obligers in your life. Is if there's an inner expectation that an obliger wants to meet, they have to have outer accountability. They must have outer accountability. And you as a questioner may be I mean, oftentimes questioners are very puzzled and frustrated by obligers because they're like, just get clear
Mm-hmm.
on your priorities,
Yep.
think it through, understand why you're doing things the way you do, and action will follow from that. That's not the experience of obligers.
Mm.
Obligers need outer accountability. And so you might present it as like, if you use this system, you're going to have more free time available to answer the questions of your students. You're going to be more available to them. You're going to be able to do higher level work, or you're going to be a role model for other teachers in your system, or you're going to model a certain kind of behavior for your students. If they see you following this kind of like really sensible practice, then they are going to copy you because as the teacher, you need to be the role model that others follow, or maybe your future self. Well, Angela right now doesn't want to do this, but future Angela is going to be really
Mm.
annoyed if now Angela doesn't do it this way and ends up wasting a lot of valuable time. So you want to think about how to present messages with this idea of outer accountability because that is what is going to resonate with obligers. and oftentimes questioners they're just like, they're like, why are you doing this? It doesn't make any sense. The fact that somebody's telling you to do it, like, who cares? But to an obliger, that's really powerful. So I think you're wise to think about how do you present different messages to different people, because the same message doesn't resonate across the tendencies.
And you know what? And the other thing that I think about when I read through your work, and also when I was reading Better Than Before, which is your book about habit creation, is thinking about how this impacts students. Because I would think it would be really challenging for an upholder or an obliger teacher to understand why a questioner student or a rebel student doesn't want to meet classroom expectations.
Yes. It's you put your finger on it. It's a huge thing, especially about upholders are just like, they just are like, what's everybody's problem? Like, get with
Right?
the program. I'm the teacher. Just get it
Yes.
done. Like, what is the fuss here? Um, and obligers are often like in a classroom situation, like in a workplace, a lot of times they get the accountability they need, and so they don't have issues. And so sometimes it is the questioners and the rebels. And I have to say, I've heard from so many questioners very poignant stories about how they had really difficult times in school because no one bothered to explain to them. I mean, literally like 10 minutes. I'm not talking like an 8 hour thing. I'm talking just briefly. Why is it that we are asking you to memorize the multiplication tables, even though you can look it up on your phone faster and more accurately? Why are we asking you to learn about ancient Mesopotamia, even though it's never going to come up in everyday life? Why do you have to learn how to do cursive when you're going to be working on your laptop all the time? Over and over, questioners will say, like, I refuse to do it. I would refuse to write the book report because it was just a stupid waste of my time, but I would study for the test because I understood that I was learning. Like, but if you take the time with a questioner child who's resisting and you're like, well, let me explain to you why you might think that this book report is stupid because you know that I know that you read the book, but let me explain to you why this is valuable and why I think this is important to you. Then they can get with the program. They just don't like that feeling of having their time wasted. And then rebels, they just don't like being told what to do. And the more that you can present them and like, this is what you want. This is what you like to do. This is a challenge that you want to meet. This works for you, or like give them options like you could do it this way, or you could do it this way, or you could do it this way. That is going to help a rebel child get with the program. To a teacher, both of those children might look the same because they're both resisting an outer expectation, but it's very different. It's coming from a very different place, questioner and rebel. So you want to know what is the tendency of the child so that you can communicate with them in a way that's going to resonate with them. But I think it's really true. It is something that comes up a lot for teachers.
And it's not always easy to tell what a student's tendency is, right? Because you can't see that from the outside. You have to really understand how the child thinks in order to know what their
Yes.
tendency is.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can't know from the outside. But I think with the teacher probably seeing a student, like, questioners like, the thing that always tips me off to a questioner, like in everyday life when I'm just walking around, is the word arbitrary. This makes question, maybe you feel this way as a questioner
Hmm.
yourself. 5 garments to a dressing room, why five? Like, this is just unthinkable to them. 55 miles an hour speed limit for every driver on the highway, like, how is this a good idea? Um, so anytime you have somebody who's saying it's arbitrary, it's inefficient, it's irrational, or saying why do we have to do this? Why do and they can be seen, and this is something questioners have to learn, is how to ask questions in a way that seem constructive, that don't seem like you're slowing down the classroom, because it's like everybody else is like knows how to do this report. Why do you keep asking question after question? Why are you questioning my authority? Are you undermining my judgment? Are you slowing things down? Are you being obstructionist? Um, and so that's very important to understand, but they just really need to understand why. And like you say, the idea that you'd say, we've always done it, that's what fourth graders have to do because I'm the teacher and I say so, these are totally illegitimate for
Hmm.
questioners. It's going to drive them crazy and inspire that spirit of resistance. Where a rebel, it's really coming from a place. So if you say something to a child and their reaction is why should I? That's a questioner. If you say something to a child and their answer is you're not the boss of me, that's a rebel. And so for a rebel, it's much more like this is what you want. You're going to do. If you do well on this test, you might make the honor roll. And the kids who go on the honor roll are going to go on the trip to Washington D.C. and that is a fun trip. Ask your friends in the older grades and they will tell you everybody wants to go on the D.C. trip. So if you want to make the honor roll, that's how you do it. It's just like, this is what you want, this is what works for you. Or like, you've always been such an amazing speller. Let's see, like, can you keep up? Like, I've seen you've gotten 100 on the last 3 quizzes. It'd be amazing if you kept up that streak. Yeah, I want to do that because I'm a great speller. I want to show the world what I can do. Um, but you're right. You really have to know from the inside of that person's head. You can't judge from the outside.
So let's see, if we're trying to get student buy-in and we want kids to meet the classroom expectations, if we think that a child is a questioner, then it's about helping them understand why. If they're a
Yes.
rebel, then it's about helping them see how this is good for them, convincing them like this is what you want. What if the
Yeah.
child is an upholder or an obliger?
Yeah. Oh, wait, I should say one more thing because rebels are a particular challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing to do with a rebel is identity. Like rebels always want to put their authentic identity into the world. So if you're like, you're a considerate member of the community, many rebels are very idealistic or have like very high values. So it's like, this is what it means to be a considerate member of our community, or this is what if other people are counting on you, you want to come through for them. You want to be the kind of person who's reliable, or you're a great artist. You want to show people what you can do. So it's that identity of who is it that you are. Um, so for an upholders are the easiest, I think, for teachers because they want to meet outer expectations, but they also have their own inner expectations, and they tend to love like to-do lists and they don't like dropping the ball. So these are the kids that check their own homework, who pack their own gym clothes, who say, can you sign my permission slip and I'll put it in the backpack and take it to the teacher, and like that all just happens. So upholders really are not a problem, but you want to make sure that upholders, if you're to the point where they need to be thinking about what they want, you have to make sure that they are thinking about what they want, because they can meet inner expectations if inner expectations are articulated. If you just say to an upholder child, well, you really should do debate team and you should be on Model UN and you should be on the basketball team, that child might be like, oh, I guess I should. Instead of, because a questioner would be like, well, why would I do debate? I'm not interested in debate. Why am I going to be on the basketball team? I don't like basketball. But an upholder might go along with that. So you want to help them understand, what do you want for yourself? Because once you know what you want for yourself, that's going to have equal weight. For an obliger, you really want to make sure that they have those outer expectations around that outer accountability around inner expectations, because they are going to find it a lot easier to like hand in the book report or write, or study for the test because they have that accountability. But what about a child who wants to do something like practice guitar on their own? Like they have this fantasy, they'd love to practice guitar. They're just going to teach themselves ukulele. Like you're not going to get a ukulele instructor, but like you could learn how to do that off YouTube, but they somehow never do it. Well, can you create outer accountability around that? Or I remember I heard somebody said her daughter had got a new puppy and was like, "Oh, I want to teach my puppy all these new tricks." And she said, "Great, we're signing you up for the 4-H competition at the state fair." Because it's like, oh, now you and your dog are in the state fair competition. Like you got to train your dog now, because it's not just like your fantasy of what your inner expectation would be. There's some form of accountability that's attached. So you want to look for what is it that the obliger wants to do for themselves and help them create the outer accountability. And often obligers will ask for accountability, and then like upholders and questioners and rebels don't want to provide it. So if your
Mm-hmm.
child says, like, I remember I was giving a talk in DC, and a woman was saying how her son wanted to take wanted to take a class to prepare for the GRE, which is the big graduate admissions test. And she said to him, she was a questioner, and she said, "No, honey, if it's important to you to do well in the test, you can just buy a book and study on your own." And then she said, "No, but now I realize my son is an obliger. He needs to take the class. He needs to know that he's shown up. He needs to have homework. He needs to have accountability to an instructor." As a questioner, she could just buy the book and study. That's how I took the bar. I like took the class on my own, did it on my own, passed the bar on my own, was just like listening to cassette tapes.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't work for most people. Most people do better when they show up to take a class or something like that. So don't get in the way. If an obliger's like, "Hey, will you ask me every day if I worked out, or will you check in with me and see if I've practiced piano?" Like a questioner might be like, "Well, if it's important to you, you'll do it. I don't want to be your babysitter." And an upholder might be like, "Well, why do I have to get involved in this? Do it or not." But an
Mm-hmm.
obliger needs outer accountability. If people ask for outer accountability, it's because they know they need it.
Right, and that's not a bad thing. It's not
No,
something that we need to
no.
stop them from doing.
No, and that is I'm so glad you said that. That's such an important point, because sometimes upholders and rebels and questioners and even obligers themselves will say it's weak. I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to have to rely on outer accountability. I want to have it self-generated. I want to have it all inner motivation. I'm like, okay, that doesn't work. By the way, let me just tell you from my observation, that doesn't work. And like 40% of people are obligers. The world is set up for accountability. This is why there are deadlines and teams and bosses and
Mm-hmm.
there's I mean most people, a lot of people need outer accountability, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's very easy to plug it in once you know that that's what you need, and there's no reason to feel like there's something wrong with you or that it's some kind of lesser form of meeting commitments. It's just the way some people are, and you don't need to fix it or change it or wish it were different. You just have to say like, okay, well, knowing what I know about myself or knowing what I know about somebody else, how do I give them the outer accountability that's necessary for them to achieve their aims? Because it's easy to have outer accountability. It's easy to plug in outer accountability, but to like force yourself to give it up if you need it is very difficult. So like don't do that. Like don't try to change yourself. Just change the way things are set up and you'll get there so much faster.
See, that's how I feel too. This is just so validating. This was actually one of the main things that I wanted to bring you on here to talk about, because one of the really pervasive ideas in education that has been in place for a long time is that intrinsic motivation is best. So, teachers are always told we got to move away from the external rewards. Kids have to develop their own purpose for learning. We can't have them dependent on external motivators. They can't be dependent on the teacher, to set up these accountability structures for them. And I've always really struggled with that as an educator, because it just doesn't jive with what I know about human nature, with what I know about kids, with what I know about how productivity works. Because in my experience, it's just nearly impossible to develop intrinsic motivation for certain tasks, especially if we're talking about low level and mundane work. And then,
Yeah.
we've also got the tendencies here where, some people always throughout their lives just achieve more when they have this external motivation, they have accountability, and intrinsic motivation is just not the driving force for them.
Well, and here's the thing, like I don't like the word motivation. I feel like the word
Mm,
motivation is very confusing because it kind of combines ideas that are very, very different from each other. It combines the idea that I really want a result. I'm very motivated to lose weight. I'm very motivated to pass the bar. Like I really want that. But it also combines the idea that I'm sort of willing to do things that will take me towards that goal. Like the idea that you're motivated to something, it kind of suggests that you're taking action. That is not the case. There are many times when you really, really desire an outcome and yet you are doing nothing in order to achieve that aim. This was very confusing to me as an upholder because that is something that upholders experience less of. Um, but so I think like putting away motivation just makes everything clearer. I think it's just clear to think of like, do I want to achieve a certain aim, and then what am I willing to do to achieve that aim?
I'm so glad that you made this point that being motivated is not the same thing as taking action. So it's pointless to say to a kid who's not turning in his or her work, don't you care about passing? Don't you care about getting into college? Because not turning in your work isn't the same thing as not caring. A kid can care deeply about his or her future and want to succeed, but taking action to achieve that goal is not necessarily related. So making sure that kids care about the goal or the expectation helps, but it's not everything. It's not the only tool that should be in our toolbox.
Now, but the thing about it, and I totally accept and think it's incredibly important. Like, if you're deeply interested in something, everything is easier. It's like the child
Mm-hmm.
who can't memorize the multiplication tables but knows every baseball statistic, or can't memorize Wordsworth but can memorize every song lyric from Rodgers and Hammerstein. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if you love, when I become passionate about a subject, I remember so many things that I couldn't remember before I was interested. So it's not like it doesn't matter how engaged you are, um, but I do think it gets confusing because it's like, yeah, how do you intrinsically motivate somebody to memorize the multiplication tables? It's
Right.
like that's just no fun. It's no fun for anyone.
Right. And that's not necessarily a key to productivity. When we're talking about, sort of pivoting here a little bit and talking about just getting things done, you don't have to have this deep intrinsic motivation for everything that you do in order
Yes.
to be productive.
Well, and in a way, it feels like a burden to try to work yourself into some state of enthusiasm. When you're just
Mm,
like, I just want to get it done. Like, I don't even want to have a mental state in relationship to it. I feel like, um, but like something like to-do lists. Okay, like speaking of productivity, well, people have wildly like there's sort of an assumption everybody everybody should have to-do lists. To-do lists are a great productivity tool. Well, they aren't for everyone. Rebels will write something down on a to-do list and then immediately refuse to do it. So they have to take that into account. So again, this idea of intrinsic motivation, like on the one hand, they want to do it because it's on their to-do list, but then the minute that they have a to-do list, they want to resist their to-do list. So that whole, it's sort of like, what does that even mean that they're intrinsically motivated? Because they're also intrinsically resistant. And so it can get very complicated.
I'm going to ask you in a moment where teachers can go to get more information from you about the different tendencies and habit creation and things. But I'm wondering if you have any advice or any resources for teachers to help students develop awareness of their own tendencies. Do you think that's useful for kids to understand their tendency?
I think it's super useful, and I've been surprised by how many children and teenagers I've heard from. One of the things many people have asked me to do is to develop a quiz for children that is specifically geared towards, child language and child scenarios. And so if anybody has any ideas, please let me know for teachers, coaches, parents, because I need to sit down and do that. It would be different because a lot of teachers and parents and coaches have asked for that. A lot of times you can tell, and the children themselves can tell if you describe it. I mean, there are 5-year-olds definitely who are clearly rebels, clearly questioners. My daughter was an upholder, obviously from the time she was 5 years old, and it's not. I mean, it's not unusual to hear about 3-year-olds. I at this point, I don't have a quiz specifically for children, but I do think that if you know the description, it's often very easy to tell what a child is. Now, not always, because children aren't autonomous in the way that adults are. So sometimes you really can't tell because they just aren't making their own decisions the way an adult is. My older daughter, I couldn't tell till she went away for college. I couldn't tell if she was a questioner or an obliger. And now I know she's a questioner because she's out on her own. But often you can tell earlier. But for resources, on my site, GretchenRubin.com, under the book, The Four Tendencies, there's a lot of resources related to the four tendencies. And there is a one sheet that's specifically for teachers, parents, and coaches that's about dealing with children and the tendencies. And then there's one for healthcare providers, and there's one for relationships, and there's one for the workplace. But there is one specifically for, like, what do you look for in a child, and how do you work with a child depending on the tendency. So I have that, or people can always just contact me through the website if they want that, and I can send it. I also have an app called the Better app, and it's free. You can find it. It's in the App Store if you just search Better Gretchen Rubin, or it's the betterapp.us if you're on desktop. And that's where people can go to talk about the four tendencies. And there's a whole discussion group there that's for teachers, parents, and coaches. And then, or also you can go into a discussion group like for rebels. Like if you're thinking like, oh my gosh, I'm a rebel and I don't understand, like, how am I going to be a parent to my rebel child? You can go there and pose questions and start conversations with people depending on it. So that's, if you really want to go deep into the four tendencies, there's a lot of conversation there.
That's awesome. So the best place for teachers to go, for both themselves and for students really, is just to go to GretchenRubin.com, and they'll be able to get all those resources and more.
Yes, exactly. And then we talk about it a lot on the Happier podcast too, because it just comes up all the time.
It's a great podcast. If anyone, anyone listening to this really likes consuming their information via audio, I highly recommend Gretchen's podcast. It's entertaining and fun and very, very relevant. So thank you for doing that podcast. Thank you for being here today also, Gretchen. I want to close out the show with what I call a takeaway truth. It's something that listeners should remember in the week ahead. And I'm wondering what you feel is the most important thing. What's something that you wish every teacher understood about what we discussed today with habit creation and tendencies?
I just think that we're all different. In many ways, we're very much like each other, but we're also different. And it's so easy, and I certainly have felt this way myself. It's so easy to assume that, like, well, what works for me is going to work for you. Or the way that I see the world is the way that other people see the world. And I really, truly believe that when you can see how other people have a different perspective, then it's not personal. It's not I'm right and you're wrong, or you're right and I'm wrong. It's just how do we understand where everybody's coming from so that we can create an environment where everyone can thrive.
Thanks so much for being on the show, Gretchen. Everyone listening can learn more about Gretchen's resources at GretchenRubin.com or go to truthforteachers.com to get a shareable link to this episode's blog post and the audio. Have a great week. You can do this. And remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it. Want more than just a weekly podcast episode from me? I'd love to also send you a weekly message of encouragement via email. I'll reach out each Sunday evening with a short message that's designed to help you feel more prepared and inspired and motivated for the week ahead. It's not a newsletter or a bunch of announcements. This goes out to over 85,000 educators. So I put just as much thought into crafting this weekly written message to my email list as I do into crafting my podcast episodes. And it's entirely unique content that you won't find anywhere else online. Just go to thecornerstoneforteachers.com/subscribe and you can sign up. That's thecornerstoneforteachers.com/subscribe.